Tonight, we're riding into the most brutal, unforgiving landscape in American history. Not a battlefield, not a desert, just cold. The kind of cold that turns your breath to ice crystals before it leaves your mouth. The kind of cold that makes steel brittle and leather crack like old paper. The kind of cold that killed more cowboys than any gunfight ever did. Picture this. It's January 1887, somewhere on the Montana plains. The sky has that strange greenish tint that old-timers know means trouble. A young cowboy, maybe 20 years old, sits on his horse, watching 3,000 head of cattle spread across a valley that stretches to the horizon. His name doesn't matter because history forgot it, along with thousands of others like him. His beard is crusted with ice. His fingers, even inside 2 layers of gloves, haven't had feeling in them for the past hour. The temperature is 50 degrees below zero, and it's dropping. Behind him, the wind is building. Not the gentle breeze of a spring morning, but something. That sounds like a freight train in the distance, getting closer. The cattle sense it too. They're bunching together, their breath creating a fog bank that hangs over the herd like a ghost. And then, without warning, the world turns white. The blizzard doesn't arrive gradually. It hits like a wall, like walking into a solid thing. Visibility drops from miles to arm's length in seconds. The wind tears at clothing, finding every gap, every opening, turning the cowboy's coat into a useless rag flapping against his frozen body. Snow doesn't fall so much as fly horizontally, each flake a tiny razor cutting exposed skin. The temperature plummets another 20 degrees. The cattle start to move, drifting with the storm, and the cowboy has a choice: follow them into the white, or turn back and let a fortune in beef disappear into the frozen wilderness. He follows, because that's what cowboys did. And over the next 72 hours, 90% of the cattle in his care will die. Some of his fellow cowboys will die too. And the ones who survive will carry the scars, physical and mental, for the rest of their lives. This winter, the winter of 1886 to 1887, will kill the romantic era of the American cowboy more effectually than any law, any fence, or any railroad ever could. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand how men survived riding through conditions that would kill most modern humans in ours, we need to go back. Back to when the Great Plains was still open range, when cattle were money, and when a cowboy's job meant facing death. So regularly that it became just another part of the routine. The world those men lived in no longer exists, and maybe that's for the best. Let's start at the beginning. In the years after the Civil War tore America apart and then stitched it back together in a new configuration. By 1865, the fighting was over, but the nation was broke, traumatized, and hungry. Literally hungry. The North had money but needed meat. The South had nothing but needed money. And Texas had a problem that would reshape the American West. Millions of longhorn cattle, and no one to buy them. These weren't modern cattle, not the docile, thick-bodied animals you see in pastures today. Longhorns were half-wild, mean as snakes, with horns that could span 8 feet tip to tip. They were descendants of Spanish ranch cattle that had been running loose in Texas for generations, breeding with whatever other cattle they encountered, getting tougher and meaner with each generation. They could survive on scrub brush and cactus, go days without water, and defend themselves against wolves and mountain lions. They were, in short, built for the harsh Texas landscape, but they were also worthless in Texas. you could buy a longhorn for $4 or $5. In Chicago or Kansas City, that same animal might fetch $40. The problem was getting them there. Texas had no railroads reaching the cattle country, no way to ship them north. The only option was to walk them, and we're not talking about a pleasant stroll. We're talking about driving thousands of cattle over 1,000 miles of open country, through Indian territory, across rivers in flood, over plains with no water, through weather that ranged from deadly heat to killing cold. This is where the cowboy enters American history, not as a gunslinging hero, but as a hired hand willing to do a job that might kill him for $30 a month. Who were these men? Not the sanitized, romanticized figures from movies and dime novels. Real cowboys were young, usually in their early 20s. They were often illiterate. 1 in 4 was black, former slaves who found that skill with horses and cattle mattered more than skin color on the open range, at least sometimes. Many were Mexican vaqueros, the original cowboys who had been doing this work for generations before Texas was even part of the United States. Some were Civil War veterans, both Union and Confederate, who couldn't settle back into civilian life and needed the kind of work that kept them moving, kept them from thinking too much. They were small men, usually, not because small men were tougher, but because horses could carry them longer. 5'6", 140 pounds, wiry and sunburnt and scarred. Their hands were gnarled from rope burns and broken fingers. Their faces were aged beyond their years from constant sun and wind. Many were missing teeth. Most had suffered broken bones that never healed quite right, and almost all of them would be dead, broke, or broken down by the time they hit 35. The work was straightforward in concept, brutal in execution. In spring, you rounded up cattle from the open range. These weren't neat, fenced pastures. The open range meant millions of acres of public land where cattle from different ranchers mixed together freely. Cowboys identified ownership by brands burned into the hide. The roundup could take weeks, gathering strays from canyons and brush. Country, cutting out your ranch's cattle from the general herd, branding new calves. Then came the drive. 3,000 head of cattle, 8 to 10 cowboys, a chuck wagon with a cook, and a wrangler managing a remuda of spare horses. The herd would stretch out in a line, sometimes 2 miles long, moving at about 10 to 15 miles per day. That doesn't sound like much until you consider they did it for months, through summer heat that could kill a man from heat stroke, across rivers swollen with spring runoff, through territory where settlers might shoot at you for letting your cattle graze their grass, and where rustlers looked for any chance to cut out part of your herd. The trail itself became legendary. The Chisholm Trail ran from South Texas to Kansas, through the heart of what's now Oklahoma. The goodnight-loving trail headed west to New Mexico and Colorado. Later trails pushed north into Montana and the Dakotas, following the expansion of railroads that could ship cattle east. Towns sprung up along these routes, places like Abilene and Dodge City, designed to separate cowboys from their wages as efficiently as possible. Summer drives were hard but manageable. You had long days, plenty of grass for the cattle, usually enough water. The biggest dangers were stampedes at night, river crossings, and the occasional storm. Cowboys died on summer drives, sure, but they died in manageable numbers. The work was dangerous but predictable. Winter was different. Winter on the Great Plains was different in a way that people who haven't experienced it cannot truly understand. This wasn't cold like a modern city cold, where you're uncomfortable between your heated car and your heated building. This was cold that wanted to kill you, and it was very good at its job. The Great Plains are essentially a masset, tilted table running from Canada down to Texas. There are no mountain ranges to break the wind until you hit the Rockies in the west. Nothing to stop Arctic air masses from sweeping down like water poured across that tilted table. When cold air from Canada met moisture coming up from the Gulf of Mexico, the collision created storms of apocalyptic intensity, and cowboys had to work through them. You might wonder why. Why drive cattle in winter? Why not wait for spring? The answer, as usual, was money. Ranchers had contracts to fulfill. Cattle needed to be moved to winter pastures before they starved on summer range. Railroad schedules didn't care about weather. Market prices fluctuated, and a herd that was profitable in November might be worthless in March. The economics of the cattle industry demanded that cattle keep moving, regardless of conditions. So cowboys rode through November snows, through December blizzards, through January cold that would freeze a man's beard solid, where his breath became ice in his mustache, where tears froze on his cheeks. The money at stake was enormous by frontier standards. 3,000 head of cattle might be worth $75,000, equivalent to over $2 million in modern currency. A single bad winter could bankrupt ranchers who had been rich the previous year. Cowboys only got their wages if the cattle arrive alive, so they had personal stakes too, though nothing compared to the owners. This created a perfect storm of pressure and danger. Valuable cargo that couldn't take care of itself, moving through an environment that actively tried to kill everything in it, watched over by underpaid young men who were already living on the edge of survival. And then the weather would turn. The blizzards that swept the Great Plains weren't predictable by any science available to cowboys. No weather satellites, no radar, no forecasts. They had animal behavior, folk wisdom, and luck. Cattle bunching together days before a storm. Birds flying south earlier than usual. The sky taking on odd colors. Sometimes you got warning. Sometimes you'd indent. There were different types of winter storms, and experienced cowboys learned to recognize the signs of each. Alberta clippers came fast, brought lighter snow but brutal cold. They'd be on you before you knew it. Temperature dropping 40 degrees in an hour. Colorado lows brought heavy snow, the kind that buried everything, but weren't quite as cold. Then there were the blue northers, so cold because the northern horizon would turn a deep blue-gray before the temperature plummeted. These were the most feared, sudden drops of 50 degrees or more, wind shifting from south to north in minutes, warm morning turning to frozen hell by afternoon, but nothing compared to a true Great Plains blizzard at full fury. The signs would start subtly. Maybe the air would get that metallic taste. Maybe horses would get agitated for no apparent reason. The wind might die completely, creating an eerie calm that old-timers knew meant something bad was building. And then, sometimes, without any warning at all, it would hit. Temperature drop came first, not gradually, but like falling off a cliff. 30-degree weather, suddenly 0. 0 suddenly 30 below. The speed of the change was shocking, violent. Your body didn't have time to adjust. 1 minute you were comfortable, the next you were shivering uncontrollably. Then the wind. Not a breeze, not a gale, but something that felt solid, that pushed you, that tore at your clothes with physical force. 40, 50 miles per hour, sometimes more. On flat prairie with nothing to stop it, the wind was a weapon. It found every gap in your clothing, every opening, turning coats into useless flapping rags and stealing body heat faster than your body could generate it. And then came the snow, not falling gently from above, but flying horizontally, driven by wind, each flake a tiny razor. The snow didn't accumulate on the ground as much as it just existed everywhere, filling the air until you couldn't see. Whiteout conditions, where the sky and ground became indistinguishable, where your horse's head disappeared from view, where the cowboy riding 10 feet away might as well be in another country. The visibility drop was terrifying. One moment you could see the horizon, could see the herd, could see your fellow cowboys. The next moment, nothing, just white, solid white in every direction. No up, no down, no landmarks, just wind and snow and cold that cut through everything, and the sound. People who survive these blizzards always mention the sound. The wind didn't howl like you might imagine. It screamed, a constant high-pitched shriek that got inside your head. That made thinking difficult. That added a psychological assault to the physical one. Combined with the temperature and wind chill, it created a sensory experience designed to break human beings. The physical effects started immediately. Exposed skin froze in minutes. Literally froze. Frostbite isn't like being cold. It's tissue. Actually freezing solid, ice crystals forming in cells, killing them. Nose, ears, cheeks, fingers, toes. The coldest extremities went first. You'd feel the burning sensation, then pain, then nothing. That nothing was when you knew you were in. Troubled ice formed on beards and mustaches, on eyelashes and eyebrows. Some cowboys' eyes froze partially shut. Breathing became painful. Inhaling air that cold hurt your lungs, a burning sensation that made every breath agony. Cowboys learned to breathe through cloth, their bandanas pressed over nose and mouth, warming the air slightly before it entered their lungs. Inside gloves, fingers went numb. The cruel choice cowboys faced constantly: keep gloves on and lose dexterity, unable to handle reins or rope, or remove gloves briefly to work and risk frostbite. Most compromised with fingerless gloves under mittens, but even that was often not enough. The psychological effects were worse in some ways. The disorientation hit fast. Without visual references, you lost your sense of direction. You thought you were riding north, but you'd turned east without realizing. Time distorted. Minutes felt like hours. Hours passed in what seemed like minutes. Cowboys would swear they'd been in the blizzard for a day when it had only been 2 hours. Or they'd think they'd only been out for an hour when it had been 6. The hallucinations started once hypothermia set in. Mild hypothermia first. You'd see things in the white. Houses that weren't there. Other riders. Cattle where there were none. Your mind, desperate for reference points, would create them. Cowboys reported seeing entire towns in the distance. Lights and buildings that vanished as soon as they rode toward them. Severe hypothermia brought worse. Body temperature dropping, brain function deteriorating, judgment evaporating. This is when Calvius made the fatal mistakes. Taking off clothes because they felt hot. a phenomenon called paradoxical undressing. That happened when the hypothalamus malfunctioned, trying to burrow into the snow, called terminal burrowing, another sign that death was close. Or simply lying down to rest, just for a minute, just to close eyes for a second. Most who did that never stood up again. The wind chill multiplied everything. At 50 below zero, with 50-mile-per-hour winds, the effective temperature felt like 90 below. At those temperatures, exposed skin froze in under 5 minutes. Any moisture, sweat from exertion, melted snow, breath condensing on fabric, immediately froze. And wetness conducted heat away from the body 30 times faster than dry cold dot. Cowboys learned to watch for ground blizzards, a particularly deadly variant where snow didn't fall from the sky but just blew across the ground in thick clouds. You couldn't see your feet. Your horse stepped carefully, feeling for solid ground. Cattle disappeared into it. Cowboys riding drag position at the back of the herd could look up and see clear sky. But around them was a river of snow flowing past, 3 feet deep, stretching to the horizon. Whiteout conditions were absolute. Not just limited visibility, but the complete absence of visual reference. Sky merged with ground. Shadows disappeared. Depth perception vanished. Cowboys rode with one hand stretched out in front of them, feeling for obstacles they couldn't see. Horses were often smarter than riders in these conditions, feeling their way forward when human eyes were useless. Temperature inversions created deadly pockets. Cold air, being denser, sank into valleys and low areas. A cowboy riding along might drop into a creek bed and suddenly be 20 degrees colder. These microenvironments were death traps. Many cowboys were found frozen in ravines, while higher ground around them was survivable. And the duration. These storms didn't blow through in an hour or two. They lasted days sometimes. The children's blizzard of January 12, 1888, came on suddenly, but lasted nearly 12 hours of full whiteout conditions. The winter of 1880 to 81, documented by Laura Ingalls Wilder in her book The Long Winter, brought blizzard after blizzard from October through April, sometimes with only a day or two of clear weather between storms. The Great Deep Winter of 1886 to 87 featured multiple storms lasting days each. With temperatures that didn't rise above zero for weeks, cowboys caught in these storms faced a simple equation: survive or die. There was no rescue coming. No one could find you even if they wanted to try. No helicopters, no cell phones, no GPS beacons. Just you, your horse, and several thousand cattle, all trying not to freeze to death. So how did they not die? How did anyone survive conditions that would kill a modern person in their shirt sleeves in under an hour? The answer was preparation, knowledge, and gear that looks primitive by modern standards but was brilliantly designed for its purpose. Cowboys didn't wear what you see in movies. They wore layers, lots of them, in materials that had been tested. By trial and error over generations, the foundation was long underwear, usually wool union suits that covered from neck to ankles. Wool was critical because it insulated even when wet, unlike cotton, which became useless when damp. Over that, a heavy flannel shirt. Again, wool, usually, thick enough that it could stand up on its own when you took it off. Then a wool vest, often made from buffalo hide, if the cowboy was lucky enough to afford it. Over all of this went a Doug. Canvas jacket, heavy and stiff, windproof if not warm by itself. The outer coat was make or break. Good cowboys saved for months to buy a proper winter coat. Buffalo hide was best, thick and heavy, fur turned inward for insulation. Bear hide worked. 2. The cheaper option was a thick wool coat, often called a mackinaw, but these were less windproof. Some cowboys wore oversized coats so they could fit extra layers underneath. The weight was brutal. These coats could be 20 pounds or more, but they might save your life. The cowboy hat, that iconic wide-brimmed symbol, was not just for sun protection. In winter, the brim blocked snow from your face. Cowboys tied their hats down with leather strings under the chin to keep wind from tearing them away. Some stuffed newspaper or cloth inside the crown for extra insulation. The hat became a sunshade, rain shield, snow blocker, emergency water bucket, and occasionally a pillow. Chaps protected legs from wind and brush. Made from thick leather, or better yet, buffalo hide. They wrapped around your legs and tied at the waist. Some cowboys wore woolies, chaps made from sheepskin with the wool turned inward. These were warmer, but got soaked in snow and became less effective. The leather ones stayed more functional in winter conditions. Boots were a problem, high-heeled. Cowboy boots kept feet in stirrups, which was critical when you might ride for 12 hours straight. But leather soaked up water like a sponge and then froze stiff. Cowboys wrapped their boots in burlap sacks, tucking the sacks into their boots to create an extra insulation layer. Some wore 2 or 3 pairs of socks, buffalo wool if they could get it. Wool socks were the only kind that mattered. Cotton. Socks in winter were a death sentence. Gloves were impossible to get right. Thick gloves kept your hands warm but made you clumsy. You couldn't feel the reins properly, couldn't tie knots, couldn't handle your rope. Thin gloves let you work but didn't keep you warm. Most cowboys used fingerless gloves for dexterity with mittens over them when they weren't actively working. But they still had to remove the mittens frequently, and fingers would go numb almost immediately in extreme cold. The bandana, that square of cloth tied around a cowboy's neck, was perhaps the most versatile piece of gear. In winter, cowboys pulled it up over their nose and mouth, creating a crude filter that warmed the air before they breathed it. This prevented the searing pain of frozen lungs and reduced the formation of ice in facial hair. Some cowboys wetted their bandanas and let them freeze, creating a stiff face shield that blocked wind beyond clothing. Cowboys carried bedrolls that were their mobile homes. These weren't lightweight, modern sleeping bags. A proper bedroll started with a ground cloth, heavy canvas, 8 to 10 pounds, that kept moisture from the ground from soaking through. On top of that went 2 or 3 wool blankets, each weighing several pounds. Some lucky cowboys had a buffalo robe, the ultimate luxury, 20 or more pounds of thick, warm, near waterproof fur. The whole thing was rolled up with an oilcloth over the outside to shed rain and snow. Fire-starting equipment was sacred. Cowboys carried matches in waterproof containers, usually a tin with a tight lid, wrapped in oilcloth, kept close to body heat. A backup kit included steel, flint, and char cloth for friction fire starting. Tinder bundles of dried grass, birch, bark, or cotton cloth were carefully protected. A small hatchet or axe for splitting wood. All of this lived in a pocket or bag that was never out of reach. Emergency supplies were sparse, but crucial. jerky and hardtack, foods that wouldn't freeze or spoil, coffee beans, precious and carefully rationed, a tin cup that served for both, coffee and melting snow for water, a knife, always as close to a universal tool as existed, and rope, a short length for emergency repairs, for tying things down, for improvising solutions to problems that hadn't occurred yet. Horse equipment mattered as much as human gear. An extra saddle blanket could be used for a person in an emergency. A horse brush was critical for removing ice buildup on the horse's coat, because that ice would conduct heat away from the animal. A grain bag, if you were lucky enough to have grain, could save your horse's life. And rawhide strips for emergency repairs to tack that could break in the cold. But knowing what to carry was only half the battle. The other half was knowing how. To use it, how to survive when everything went wrong and the world turned white and deadly. Building shelter in a blizzard was an improvised art. Cowboys learned to use their horses as windbreaks. Get the horse between you and the wind, huddle against its body, share warmth. Horses hated this, but understood on some level that cooperation meant survival for both. Some cowboys would dig snow caves, hollowing out drifts to create protected spaces. This sounds insane, using snow for shelter, but snow is actually a decent insulator when you're protected from wind. Cowboys would crawl into these caves and wait out the worst of the storm. Finding natural shelter was luck and skill combined. Creek beds offered some protection, their banks blocking wind from at least one direction. Rock outcroppings, rare on the plains but present in some areas, could save your life. The lee side of hills, scattered stands of trees, though these were few and far between on much of the plains. Cowboys learned to read terrain, to see potential shelter before they needed it. And then there was the famous, possibly apocryphal, but likely true method, the buffalo burrito. When all else failed, when death was certain otherwise, a cowboy might kill a buffalo if he found one, gut it, and crawl inside the carcass for warmth. It sounds too grotesque to be true, but heat is heat, and body cavities hold warmth. Several accounts mention this technique, describe matter-of-factly as a life-saving measure. The smell would be horrific, the experience traumatic, but you'd be alive. Starting a fire in a blizzard was nearly impossible, but critically important. Finding a protected spot was first priority. A creek bed with overhanging banks, the space between snowdrifts. Any place where wind couldn't immediately blow out your match flame. Cowboys used sagebrush when they could find it. It burned hot and fast, easier to ignite than wood, but it burned out quickly. Buffalo chips, dried dung scattered across the plains were more reliable. They burned slower, produced steady heat, didn't need to be dry. The smell wasn't pleasant, but who cared about smell when you were freezing to death? The real challenge was getting a fire started when your hands were numb, when wind kept blowing out matches, when everything was wet or frozen. This is where the friction fire kit came in. Striking steel against flint produced sparks. If you had charcloth, you could catch a spark, blow it into flame, and transfer it to your tinder bundle. But doing this with frozen fingers, in howling wind, in near darkness, required skill and desperation in equal measure. Once started, keeping the fire going became a full-time job. Wind would try to blow it out. Snow would try to bury it. You'd need to constantly feed it fuel while also trying to warm yourself. Cowboys learned to build small fires in protected spots rather than big fires that consumed fuel too fast and provided too much heat in one spot rather than steady warmth. When fire wasn't possible, staying warm without it meant movement or insulation, or both. Cowboys would walk, leading their horses to avoid exhausting the animals, moving constantly to generate body heat. But this risked exhaustion, sweating, losing your way. The alternative was to burrow into snowdrifts, using snow as insulation. This works because snow traps air, creating dead air space that holds heat. You'd dig in, pile snow around you, and wait. Your body heat would actually warm the small space enough to prevent freezing. Not comfortable, but survivable. Spooning. Sleeping pressed together with other cowboys was common and had none of the weird connotations modern people might imagine. Heat is heat. Two bodies generate more warmth than one, especially when pressed together so heat can transfer. Cowboys would sleep in pairs or groups, usually fully clothed, sometimes sharing blankets, pressed back to front like spoons in a drawer. Survival eliminated any concerns about personal space or masculinity. Breathing technique mattered more than you'd think. Breathing through fabric warmed the air somewhat. Short, shallow breaths, rather than deep breaths, reduced the amount of cold air entering your lungs. Some cowboys learned to breathe through their noses despite the pain because the nasal passages warmed air slightly better than mouth breathing. Every little advantage mattered. Navigation without visibility was part skill, part luck, part trusting. Your horse? Cowboys memorized landmarks before storms hit. They noted wind direction and used it as a rough compass, though wind could shift. Stars, when briefly visible through breaks in clouds, provided direction. But mostly they trusted their horses. Horses have an uncanny ability to find their way home, some combination of smell, memory, and instinct that humans don't possess. Many cowboys owe their lives to horses that brought them back to camp when the riders themselves were completely lost. Preventing frostbite was a constant battle. You had to check your extremities constantly. Feel your nose, your ears, your fingers, your toes. If you couldn't feel them, that was bad. If they hurt, that was actually good, because pain meant tissue was still alive. The burning sensation of early frostbite was your warning. Cowboys would rub their faces, careful not to rub too hard because frozen tissue is brittle. They'd move their fingers and toes inside gloves and boots, generating heat and blood flow. The danger of sweat was counterintuitive but real. Exertion made you sweat, even in extreme cold. That moisture would freeze against your skin, creating a layer of ice that conducted heat away from your body. Cowboys learned to work at a steady pace, avoiding the exertion that produced sweat. They'd strip off layers when working hard, even in freezing temperatures, to stay dry. Then add layers back when they stopped. Managing moisture was as important as managing cold. Managing the horse was critical because if your horse died, you probably died. Horses could freeze faster than humans in some ways. Their larger bodies generated more heat but also had more surface area to lose it from. Ice would build up in their nostrils, making breathing difficult. It would cake on their eyelashes, partially blinding them. Cowboys had to constantly check their horses, clearing ice, making sure the animals were still functioning. The relationship between cowboy and horse was more than practical. Your horse was your partner, your lifeline, sometimes your only companion. for hours or days. Cowboys learned to read their horse's condition better than they read their own. A horse's breathing pattern, its gait, how it held its ears, all told you things about how it was handling conditions. Smart cowboys trusted their horses. Instincts often more than their own judgment. Horses could sense danger that humans couldn't. They'd refuse to cross ice that looked solid but was actually thin. They'd get agitated before a storm hit, sometimes hours before human senses detected anything wrong. They could smell water from miles away, find their way home in conditions where cowboys were completely disoriented. Native American horsemen had known this for generations. Cowboys learned it the hard way. But horses also had limitations cowboys had to manage carefully. A horse worked too hard would sweat even in extreme cold. That sweat would freeze in its coat, creating an insulating barrier that actually trapped cold against the animal's skin rather than keeping it out. This could kill a horse faster than you'd think. Cowboys learned to work horses at moderate paces, to walk them during severe cold rather than trot or gallop. Feed was another constant concern. Horses needed enormous amounts of calories in cold weather, burning energy just to maintain body temperature. A horse doing hard work in extreme cold might need 20 pounds of grain a day plus whatever grass or hay it could find. Most trail drives didn't carry that much grain. You relied on grass, which meant horses gradually lost condition over winter drives, getting thinner and weaker even as you needed them most. Not riding hard was essential. A running horse generated heat through exertion, but also sweat. That sweat would freeze in the animal's coat, creating the same deadly insulation problem humans faced. Cowboys walked their horses when possible, rode them at steady paces, and dismounted periodically to reduce the burden on the animal. A tired horse was a dead horse, and a dead horse meant a dead cowboy. Breaking ice for water was a daily task. Rivers and streams froze solid. Cowboys would have to chop through ice, sometimes a foot thick, to reach water beneath. The cattle needed enormous amounts of water, and horses needed water. Keeping water sources open was exhausting work, and in the worst cold, water would freeze over again within an hour of breaking it. Some survival techniques didn't work despite seeming logical. Alcohol, for instance. Cowboys believed whiskey warmed them, and it did feel warm going down. But alcohol causes vasodilation, blood vessels widening, which increases blood flow to the skin. This actually increases heat loss. Many cowboys died thinking they were warming up when they were actually accelerating their own freezing. Drunk cowboys died at higher rates than sober ones. Sitting still to conserve energy seemed smart but was often fatal. Once you stopped moving, once your body temperature dropped, it became harder to start moving again. Your muscles got sluggish. Your coordination failed. That fatigue that made you want to sit down and rest was often the first sign that you were losing the battle. Cowboys were found frozen in sitting positions, leaning against trees or rocks, having stopped to rest and never gotten back up. Taking shortcuts through unfamiliar terrain was tempting when you were desperate but usually deadly. In a whiteout, you couldn't recognize landmarks. What looked like a straight path to safety might be a ravine, a frozen river with thin ice, an area where snow had drifted deep enough to trap a horse. Many cowboys were found in spring only 100 yards from shelter, having gotten lost in the final stretch, wandering in circles until they collapsed. The survival techniques that worked were often brutally simple. Keep moving. Stay as dry as possible. Protect your extremities. Don't panic. Trust your horse. And above all, don't give up. Mental toughness mattered as much as physical preparation. The will to live, the refusal to accept death, kept cowboys alive when everything else failed. But let's be honest about what winter work actually looked like on the ground. Let's walk through a typical day on a winter cattle drive, because the reality was both more boring and more terrifying than you might imagine. The day started at 3 in the morning, and started is generous because many cowboys never really slept. Night watch meant 2-hour shifts all night, so you might get 6 hours of broken sleep if you were lucky. You'd wake in absolute darkness, the coldest hour of the night. Frost coating your sleeping bag, your breath visible as a cloud even in the dark. The morning routine began with the most important decision of the day, leaving the warmth of your bedroll. Every cell in your body screamed to stay where you were, to pull the covers tighter, to ignore the coming day. But you couldn't. The cattle needed tending. Your fellow cowboys were depending on you. The trail boss would have words if you shirked. So you'd force yourself up, muscles stiff from cold, joints aching, body protesting every movement. Getting dressed when you'd slept in most of your clothes meant just adding layers. Pull on the boots that had been tucked into your bedroll, too. Keep them from freezing solid. Struggle with gloves, fingers already numb from the few seconds of exposure. Put on your coat, your hat, and stumble toward the fire that someone, usually the cook, had already started. The fire was the heart of morning camp. Cowboys gathered around it like it was a shrine, which in a sense it was. The shrine of not freezing to death. Hands held out to the flames, absorbing heat that never seemed to penetrate deep enough. Rotating slowly, warming front, then back, like a rotisserie chicken. The smoke stung eyes, but no one moved. Smoke was a small price for heat. Coffee was sacred. Not good coffee, not fancy coffee, just coffee. The cook would make it strong enough to strip paint, black as sign, hot enough to burn your mouth. Cowboys would wrap both hands around their tin cups, absorbing warmth through their palms, sipping carefully, feeling the heat spread through their bodies. That first cup of coffee was sometimes the best moment of the entire day. Breakfast was fast and functional. Hardtack, essentially flour and water baked into bricks so hard you could break teeth on them. Salt pork, fatty and preserved, fried in its own grease. Maybe beans left over from the night before, reheated. The food was fuel, nothing more. You ate it because you needed calories to generate heat to survive. Taste was a luxury no one expected. Saddling. Horses with stiff, numb fingers was an exercise in frustration and pain. Leather was brittle in the cold, prone to cracking. Buckles and straps were stiff, hard to manipulate. Your fingers didn't work right, fumbling with simple tasks that would take seconds in normal conditions. But you had to do it right. A poorly secured saddle could get you killed. So you took your time, even as the cold bit deeper, even as the pre-dawn darkness made everything harder. The morning meeting with the trail boss was brief. He'd assigned positions for the day, point riders. The most experienced would lead the herd, choosing the path, watching for obstacles. Swing riders, positioned along the sides of the front third of the herd, kept cattle from wandering. Flank riders, further back along the sides, did the same job but with more cattle trying to escape. And drag riders, the least experienced, ate. Everyone's dust at the back, pushing stragglers forward. Checking the cattle count was critical. Cowboys would ride around the herd, doing a rough count, looking for sick or injured animals, making sure overnight losses hadn't been too severe. In good conditions, you might lose 1 or 2 cattle a day to accidents or predators. In winter, the number was higher. Every morning brought the discovery of frozen cattle, their stiff bodies scattered around the night's bedding ground. Weather assessment was more art than science. The trail boss would look at the sky, feel the wind, watch how the cattle behaved. Old-timers had folk wisdom. Red sky at morning, sailor, take warning. Ring around the moon, storm will come soon. When cattle bunch together, weather will get wetter. Some of it was superstition. Some of it was observational science passed down through generations. And sometimes you had no warning at all. Planning the day's route involved balancing multiple factors. How far could you push the herd without exhausting them? Where was the next water source? Where might you find shelter if weather turned bad? Were there any obstacles ahead? Frozen rivers or steep terrain? The goal was 10 to 15 miles, but in winter, you might only make 5. Or you might make none, if conditions were bad enough. Once the herd started moving, the rhythm of the day set in. It was simultaneously mind-numbing and requiring constant attention. The cattle stretched out in a long line, 2 miles of animals moving at a walking pace. Cowboys took their positions, riding slowly, watching constantly, making small corrections, to keep the herd together and moving in the right direction. The point riders had the best job in terms of prestige, but the hardest job in terms of responsibility. They rode ahead of the herd, choosing the path, looking for dangers. A frozen river with thin ice could kill dozens of cattle and riders. A hidden ravine could trap the herd. The point riders had to be alert, scanning constantly, reading terrain, making decisions that affected everyone. The swing riders had it easier in some ways. They just kept cattle from wandering. But just is misleading. Cattle are not smart animals, but they're stubborn and have a knack for going exactly where you don't want them to. A single cow would see something interesting off to the side and decide to investigate. The swing rider had to stop her, turn her back, and do it without starting a domino effect that got other cattle following. It was constant, small battles all day long. Flank riders did the same job further back where more cattle were trying to escape, because they could smell the freedom of the stragglers behind them. The work was harder, the dust worse, and you got less respect. But it was still better than drag. Drag riders had the worst job on any cattle drive. Winter or summer, but winter made it especially miserable. You rode at the back of the herd, eating the dust kicked up by thousands of hooves, pushing the slowest, sickest, stubbornest cattle forward. Calves that were struggling, old cows that were exhausted, ornery steers that just didn't want to move. And in winter, you were also dealing with cattle that were on the edge of freezing to death, weak and barely able to walk. The dust was unbelievable. Even in winter, even with snow on the ground, the cattle kicked up dirt and snow in clouds that choked you, filled your nose, coated your clothes, got in your eyes. Drag riders wrapped their bandanas over their faces, but it didn't help much. By the end of the day, you'd be coughing up dirt, blowing mud out of your nose, and finding grit in every crease and fold of your body. The remuda, the herd of spare. Horses managed by the wrangler followed along with the chuck wagon. Each cowboy needed multiple horses because riding the same horse all day would kill it. Cowboys would change horses 3 or 4 times a day, switching to fresh mounts. The wrangler's job was keeping these horses together, healthy and available when needed. Lose a remuda and the entire drive was dead in the water, or dead in the snow, as the case might be. The challenges that made each day hell were varied and unpredictable. River crossings in winter were nightmares. You'd approach a river, likely frozen over, and need to assess if the ice would hold. Too thin and cattle would break through, plunging into freezing water, drowning or dying of hypothermia. Cowboys would test the ice carefully, sometimes dismounting and walking on it, listening for cracks, feeling for give. If the ice was thick enough, you'd drive the cattle across, hoping and praying. If it wasn't, you'd have to find a ford, a shallow area where cattle could wade across. This meant breaking ice, forcing cattle into water they didn't want to enter, and dealing with animals that emerged on the other side, soaking wet and rapidly freezing. Cowboys who fell through ice had minutes to live. Water at freezing temperature would drop your core body temperature so fast that you'd lose the ability to swim, to climb out, to do anything useful. Other cowboys would have to move fast, ropes thrown, riders dismounting to help, and if they pulled you out, you then faced the challenge of not dying from wet clothes in freezing air. Strip everything off, wrap in dry blankets if you had them, get to a fire if one existed. Many cowboys died dry on the riverbank after surviving the water. Stampedes. In blizzards were terror in its purest form. Something would spook the herd. Lightning, though rare in winter, would do it. Wolves howling nearby. A strange sound in the wind. The smell of a predator. And suddenly 3,000 head of cattle were running, panicked, in a blizzard where you couldn't see more than a few feet. Cowboys would try to turn the stampede, riding alongside the leaders, shooting pistols to get their attention, trying to angle them into a mill, a circular pattern where the herd would run in a circle and eventually tire themselves out. But doing this in a whiteout, where you couldn't see the cattle until you were practically on top of them, where you risked being trampled yourself, required courage that bordered on suicidal. The aftermath of a stampede could take days to deal with. Cattle scattered across miles of terrain. Some would be found frozen, having run until they collapsed from exhaustion and cold. Others would be injured, broken legs from falls, gouged by other cattle's horns. And some would just be gone, lost. In the vast emptiness of the plains, wandering until they died or were found by wolves. Equipment failures were constant. Saddles would crack in the cold, leather splitting along stress lines. Repair them with rawhide strips, hoping the patch would hold. Ropes became stiff and unmanageable, hard to coil, hard to throw. Wagon wheels would crack, spokes splitting, iron rims loosening. The chuck wagon breaking down was a minor disaster, because all your food, all your supplies, all your bedrolls were on that wagon, and horseshoes. Modern people don't think about horseshoes much, but they're critical. Horses' hooves wear down on rough terrain. The metal shoes protect them, but in winter, snow packed into the horseshoes, creating ice balls that made walking painful and dangerous. For the horse, cowboys had to regularly clean their horses' hooves, picking out packed snow and ice. An unpleasant task when your hands were already numb. Medical emergencies on the trail were dealt with by the chuck wagon cook, who served as Unofficial doctor despite having no medical training. Frostbite was common. Fingers and toes would turn white, then grey, then black if the tissue died. The treatment was warming the affected area slowly, which was agonizing. Cowboys with severe frostbite would scream as blood flow returned to damaged tissue. Pneumonia. From wet clothes and cold exposure killed more cowboys than accidents. It would start as a cough, progress to fever, then to fluid in the lungs. Without antibiotics, which didn't exist yet, treatment was rest, warmth, and hope in the persons. Immune system could fight it off. Many couldn't. Cowboys would die wheezing in their bedrolls, drowning in their own fluids. Broken bones from falls or kicks from horses required setting without anesthesia. The cook would pull the limb straight, set the bone by feel, and splint it with whatever was available. Whiskey was the anesthetic, and it didn't work very well. Cowboys bit down on leather straps and tried not to scream. Some passed out from pain, which was a mercy. Finding water for thousands of cattle and dozens of horses was a daily challenge. Streams would be frozen. Cowboys would have to break through ice, creating and maintaining drinking holes, exhausting. Work with axes and poles. The cattle would crowd around these holes, pushing, shoving, and cowboys had to manage the chaos, making sure animals didn't fall in or trample each other. Some days you couldn't find water at all. The route had been planned around known water sources, but those might be frozen solid or unreachable due to terrain or weather. Cattle and horses could go a day or two without water, eating snow to supplement, but it wasn't ideal. Dehydration weakened them, made them more susceptible to cold, slowed the herd further. Finding shelter at the end of the day was the light at the end of the tunnel that kept cowboys going. Looking for any break in the terrain, any spot that offered protection from wind. A creek bed, a stand of trees, the lee side of a hill. The chuck wagon would be positioned to block wind. Bedrolls would be unrolled on the ground, with the chuck wagon providing some shelter. The evening meal was the high point of the day, which tells you something about how miserable the day had been. The cook would have been working since you'd stopped, starting a fire, preparing food, making coffee. The menu was monotonous. Beans, called whistleberries by cowboys for obvious digestive reasons. Biscuits, either proper ones, if the cook was skilled, or hard lumps if he wasn't. Salt pork or beef, fried or boiled. Dried fruit if supplies allowed. And coffee, always coffee, sometimes the only thing that made life bearable, on rare occasions. When supplies allowed and the cook was feeling generous or guilty about how terrible everything was, he'd make something special. Peach cobbler, baked in a Dutch oven over the fire. Rice pudding with raisins, called spotted pup. Fruit pie. These luxuries were remembered and talked about for weeks. Cowboys would gather around the fire after eating, extending the warmth as long as possible before having to retreat to their cold bedrolls. This was when the community aspect of cowboy life showed through. They'd tell stories, mostly lies, about past adventures and narrow escapes. They'd play cards for matchsticks or buttons, since real gambling was usually forbidden. Someone might play a harmonica or fiddle, sad tunes that matched the mood. But mostly they'd just sit, too tired for much conversation, staring into the fire, lost in thought. Missing home, if they had homes. Missing warmth and comfort and normalcy. Some would write letters if they were literate, though the letters might not be mailed for weeks or months. Others would mend equipment, preparing for the next day. And eventually, one by one, they'd give in to exhaustion and retreat to their bedrolls. Night watch was the loneliest duty. 2 cowboys at a time would circle the herd, moving in opposite directions so they'd meet periodically. The job was keeping cattle calm, watching for problems, and staying awake. The last part was hardest. After a day of riding in brutal cold, your body wanted to sleep desperately, but falling asleep on night watch could get people killed. Cowboys sang while on watch, not because they enjoyed singing or thought they were good at it, but because it kept the cattle calm. Cattle are skittish. Animals, strange sounds would spook them, but constant, regular sounds, like human voices, would reassure them that nothing was wrong. The songs were usually old ballads, sea shanties adapted to land, folk songs from various cultures, Red River Valley, the old Chisholm Trail, Home on the Range, made-up songs about missing women and bad weather and ornery cattle. The lyrics didn't matter. The steady sound did. The night air was different from day cold. Colder, somehow penetrating. The wind often died down at night, but the temperature dropped further. Stars on clear nights were brilliant, more stars than you'd see. In any modern city, the Milky Way, a glowing river across the sky. On cloudy nights, the darkness was absolute. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face. You rode by feel, trusting your horse to see better than you could. What you watched for during night watch varied. Predators, primarily. Wolves would circle cattle herds, looking for weak animals to pull down. Cowboys would shoot at them if they got too close, though shooting in the dark was more about making noise to scare them off than actually hitting anything. Mountain lions in some areas. Coyotes, though they were mostly after scraps around camp rather than full-grown cattle. Rustlers were a real danger. Cattle thieves would watch herds, waiting for opportunities to cut out a few head in the darkness. Night watch cowboys were armed and had standing orders to shoot first, if they saw anyone approaching the herd who shouldn't be there. This led to some tragic mistakes when cowboys from the same outfit didn't recognize each other in darkness. Signs of stampede starting were subtle. Cattle getting restless, standing up when they should be sleeping, moving around nervously. An experienced night watch cowboy could feel the tension building and would alert his partner, then wake the camp if necessary. Better to wake everyone unnecessarily than to be caught sleeping when 3,000 cattle suddenly decided to run. Sick cattle needed attention. Cows that were lying down when others were standing. Calves that seemed weak or were wandering away from their mothers. Cattle that sounded wrong, their breathing labored, their movements sluggish. In winter, these were often signs that an animal was dying of cold, and there wasn't much you could do except note its location for morning, and you watched each other. The 2 cowboys on watch had a responsibility to keep each other awake and safe. If you saw your partner slumped in his saddle, not moving, you'd ride over, check on him, shake him awake if necessary. Because falling asleep on a horse in that cold could be fatal. You'd fall, hit the ground, and not wake up. Your partner finding you frozen in the morning. The songs cowboys sang on night watch became part of American musical tradition. They weren't beautiful in any technical sense. Cowboys weren't trained singers, but the songs were real, raw, honest expressions of loneliness and hardship and homesickness. They'd been collected by musicologists, recorded by folk singers, and became the foundation for country and western music. Those nights, alone on a horse, singing to cattle to keep them calm while trying to stay awake and not freeze to death, produced art that lasted longer than the cowboys who created it. But Night Watch was just one night. Winter was months. And in one particular winter, everything that could go wrong did go wrong on a scale that changed the American West forever. The winter of 1886 to 1887 started with warning signs that everyone ignored. The summer of 1886 had been brutally hot and dry across the Great Plains. Grass that usually grew knee-high barely reached ankle height. Water sources dried up. Cattle were already stressed, already thinner than they should be going into fall. But the cattle industry was booming. The beef bonanza, they called it. Eastern investors, European investors, money flooding into ranching. Cattle were profitable, and more cattle meant more profit. So ranchers kept stocking the range, adding more and more animals to land that was already overgrazed. By fall of 1886, estimates put the number of cattle on the Great Plains at 4 to 5 million head. Way more than the land could sustainably support old-timers. The cowboys and ranchers who'd been working the plains for decades looked at the situation and worried. They'd seen bad winters before. They knew what happened when cattle entered. Winter already weakened. They tried to warn people, but money talks louder than experience. The boom was too good. No one wanted to hear that it might end. The warning signs from nature were there too. Animals behaving strangely, birds flying south earlier than usual, great flocks heading to warmer climates weeks ahead of schedule. Beavers collecting more, with the normal for their winter stores. Cattle growing thicker, shaggier coats than typical. Their bodies preparing for something their owners didn't want to acknowledge. The first snows came in November, earlier than normal and heavier. This wasn't the light dusting that might melt off in a day or two. This was real snow, accumulating, sticking around, and it didn't melt between storms. Each new snow built on the previous one, creating deeper and deeper coverage. By December, much of the plains was under 6 inches of snow that never melted, and cattle were already struggling to find grass. Temperature drops in December were concerning but not yet catastrophic. Colder than normal, hovering around 0 most days, dropping well below at night. Cowboys were working hard to keep cattle alive, breaking through snow so they could reach grass, herding them to areas where wind had blown snow clear, trying to supplement with whatever hay they had, which wasn't much because storing hay for winter wasn't common practice yet. The problem was the sheer number of cattle. Too many animals competing for too little food in a landscape where snow blocked access to what grass remained. Cattle began to lose weight rapidly, ribs showing through hide, hip bones prominent, eyes sunken. The animals were starving, and there was little cowboys could do about it on the scale needed. And then January 9th, 1887 arrived, and hell came to the Great Plains. The day started cold but calm. Cowboys who survived later said the air had that strange quality, a metallic taste, a feeling of pressure, the kind of morning where experienced hands looked at each other and said nothing because there was nothing to say. They knew what was coming, they just didn't know how bad it would be. By noon, the temperature had dropped another 20 degrees. By mid-afternoon, snow was falling. Not gently, but in that angry, horizontal way that means you're in for it. Wind picked up, 30 miles per hour, then 40, then 50, then stronger. Temperature plummeted. 30 below, then 40, then 50. Some estimates put it at 60 below zero in some areas, though accurate measurements didn't exist. And then the blizzard truly hit. 16 inches of snow in less than 24 hours. Wind speeds that made measurement meaningless. Gusts probably over 70 miles per hour in exposed areas. Visibility dropped to zero. Not low visibility. Zero. Nothing. White everywhere. White and wind and cold that defied description. The storm lasted 72 hours without a break. 3 days and nights of continuous blizzard. Cowboys who tried to tend cattle got lost within 100 yards of shelter. Horses froze where they stood. Cattle, already weakened from months of starvation, began dying in massive numbers almost immediately. What happened to the cattle was apocalyptic. They couldn't find food under snow that deep. They couldn't break through to grass. They couldn't survive on what little they might scrape up, even if they could reach it. And they were already weakened from the previous months of poor grazing. They simply didn't have the reserves to survive. Cattle began a death march, drifting with the storm because they couldn't stand still in that wind. They walked until they couldn't walk anymore, until their legs gave out, until they collapsed. They piled up against fences, those who had been unfortunate enough to be on fenced ranges, suffocating or freezing in massive heaps. They fell into ravines and coulees, breaking legs, freezing in the depths. They got stuck in snowdrifts, unable to free themselves, entombed in white. Many just froze where they stood. The cold was so intense that cattle would stand still, ice forming on their hides, and simply freeze solid, still standing, monuments to nature's power. Some were found months later, still upright, mummified by cold and wind. The death toll among cattle was staggering. Estimates vary, but conservative numbers put it at 40 to 60% of all cattle on the Great Plains. Some ranchers lost 90%. Hundreds of thousands dead. Maybe more than 1 million. The exact number will never be known because counting was impossible and many cattle were simply never found. Why was it so catastrophic? Because the open range system had no safety net. Cattle roamed across millions of acres. There was no central location to bring them in. No shelters built to house them. No stored hay in quantities that could feed millions of animals. The entire system depended on cattle being able to fend for themselves year-round. That worked in normal winters. It failed catastrophically in this one. And it wasn't just this one storm. February brought more blizzards. March too. The winter refused to end. Each storm killed more cattle. Each period between storms was too short for animals to recover. The brutal cold persisted. Many areas didn't see temperatures above zero for weeks at a time. Cowboys tried to save what they could. They rode out in impossible conditions, attempting to herd cattle to whatever shelter existed, trying to break snow so cattle could reach grass, attempting anything that might reduce losses. Most efforts failed. The scale was too large. The conditions too severe. The cattle too far gone. Many cowboys died trying, caught in blizzards while attempting to reach stranded cattle, freezing to death because they stayed out too long, getting lost in whiteouts, or simply succumbing to cold while trying to do a job that had become impossible. Their bodies were often found in spring, frozen in positions that suggested they'd died still trying to help cattle that were already dead. The personal accounts from survivors are haunting. Granville Stewart, a Montana rancher, watched helplessly as his herd died. He later wrote that a business that had been fascinating before suddenly became distasteful. The joy had been killed along with the cattle. The most famous artistic response came from Charlie Russell, later to become one of America's most famous Western artists, but at this time just a young working cowboy. His employer, worried about his investment, wrote to Russell asking about the status of the herd. Russell's response was a watercolor painting showing an emaciated cow, standing in deep snow, surrounded by wolves waiting for her to die. He titled it "Waiting for a Chinook," referring to the warm winds that could melt snow. It was later renamed "Last of 5,000," referring to the herd size that this lone cow represented. That painting became the iconic image of the Great Diop. It showed, better than words could, the totality of the disaster. Individual stories emerged of both heroism and tragedy. Cowboys who saved small bunches of cattle through superhuman effort. Cowboys who sheltered in line shacks and survived on horse meat when supplies ran out. Cowboys who made fatal mistakes and died within sight of safety. Cowboys who went insane from isolation and cold and starvation. One tale tells of 3 cowboys trapped in a line shack for 3 months, snowed in with supplies for 2 weeks. They killed one of their 3 horses and rationed the meat, boiled bones for broth, burned furniture when firewood ran out. All 3 survived, but all 3 quit cowboying afterward, traumatized by the experience. Another story describes a cowboy found frozen sitting against a tree, a letter in his pocket addressed to his mother. He'd written describing being lost in a blizzard, knowing he was dying, writing by moonlight when the storm briefly cleared. The letter ended mid-sentence, his fingers too frozen to continue. He was never identified. The letter was kept by the person who found him and became one of those haunting documents of frontier tragedy. When spring finally came in April, the thaw revealed the scope of disaster. Carcasses everywhere, as far as you could see in every direction, piled in ravines, 10 deep, lining creek beds, tangled in barbed wire fences, bloated bodies floating in swollen rivers. The smell was indescribable and lasted for months. Cleanup was impossible. There were simply too many dead cattle over too much area. Most were left where they fell, to rot, to be scavenged by wolves and birds, to eventually return to the soil. Water sources were contaminated. Disease spread. The environmental impact lasted for years. Cowboys spent weeks in roundups, trying to determine what had survived. Brands were everywhere among the dead, evidence of whose cattle had been wiped out. Some ranchers found only a handful of survivors from herds of thousands. Others found nothing at all. The calculations of losses took months and resulted in financial ruin spreading across the plains. The financial collapse was immediate and total. Ranchers who'd been millionaires were bankrupt, life savings wiped out, mortgaged ranchers foreclosed. The banks that had loaned money to ranchers failed when those loans couldn't be repaid. Eastern and European investors pulled their money out, fleeing the industry entirely. The scope of the financial disaster extended far beyond the immediate victims. Consider a typical ranch that had borrowed heavily during the boom years, as most did. They'd mortgage their land to buy more cattle, betting on continued high prices and mild winters. When 90% of their herd died, they couldn't make their loan payments. The bank foreclosed, taking the land. But the bank couldn't sell the land because nobody was buying ranches in a crashed market. So the bank failed too, taking with it the savings of local depositors who'd had nothing to do with ranching. Insurance didn't exist for this kind of loss. There was no federal disaster relief, no safety net of any kind. If you lost everything, you lost everything. Some ranchers had diversified, had other income sources or investments that softened the blow. Most hadn't. They'd put everything into cattle, because cattle had seemed like printing money. The psychological impact of sudden poverty after wealth is hard to overstate. Men who'd been respected community leaders, who'd employed dozens of people, who'd been building ranching empires, suddenly had nothing. Their identities were wrapped up in their success, and that success evaporated in a single winter. Some handled it stoically, picking themselves up and starting over. Others couldn't cope. Newspaper accounts from 1887 and 1888 mention suicides obliquely, respectable papers of the era being reluctant to discuss such matters directly. But they're there, between the lines. Mr. Johnson was found deceased in his barn. Mr. Thompson succumbed to a self-inflicted wound. Men who saw no way forward, no way to rebuild, no way to face the shame and loss. Stock prices for cattle crashed. Animals that had been worth $40 before the winter were worth $5 after, if you could find buyers at all. Many ranchers couldn't give cattle away because buyers knew there would be more desperate sellers tomorrow, offering even lower prices. The domino effect hit every business connected to ranching. Feed suppliers went bankrupt. Tack and equipment suppliers lost their customer base. Banks failed. Towns that had sprung up to serve the cattle industry died as money dried up. Merchants closed their doors. Real estate prices collapsed. An entire economy built on cattle evaporated. The human toll was harder to quantify, but no less real. Families were displaced. Entire households picking up and leaving the plains, admitting defeat. Some tried to head back east, to whatever they'd left behind, if anything still existed there. Others just moved on, looking for new opportunities, new ways to make a living. Suicides among ruined ranchers were mentioned in letters and newspapers of the time, though numbers weren't officially tracked. Men who'd built everything they had, who'd poured their lives into their ranches, who saw everything destroyed in a single winter, sometimes couldn't face starting over. The psychological trauma of total financial ruin, combined with the trauma of watching helplessly as animals suffered and died by the thousands, broke some people. Cowboys found themselves unemployed by the thousands. The jobs simply disappeared. Ranchers who survived had small herds that didn't need large crews. Many outfits disbanded entirely. Cowboys drifted to towns, looking for any work, finding nothing because the entire regional economy was depressed. Some headed east. Some went to other regions, Texas or California. Some turned to outlawry, seeing no other options. But more than the immediate impacts, more than the deaths and bankruptcy and unemployment, the winter of 1886 to 87 changed the fundamental nature of ranching in America. It killed the open range system. It killed the romantic ideal of the free-roaming cowboy and the untamed frontier. Why did this winter change everything when previous hard winters hadn't? scale, timing, and economics. The scale of overstocking meant the losses were too large to absorb. The timing, coming at the peak of the boom, meant the contrast was stark and the financial impact severe. And the economics proved that the open-range system was fundamentally unsustainable. The changes that followed were swift and permanent. Ranchers who survived or who rebuilt did so differently. Smaller herds, fenced ranges instead of open range, controlling where cattle grazed, hay storage for winter, barn and shed construction to shelter animals during the worst weather, better breeding programs, developing hardier cattle that could better survive winter conditions. The long trail drives ended. Railroads expanded into cattle country, making it unnecessary to walk cattle 1,000 miles to market. You could ship them instead, faster, safer, more profitable. This eliminated one of the primary jobs cowboys had performed and reduced the number of cowboys needed. Cowboys who remained were transformed from trail drivers into ranch hands. They worked year-round at fixed locations instead of seasonal trail work. They became employees of specific ranchers rather than hired hands moving. Between jobs, the work became less adventurous, more routine. Fixing fences, maintaining equipment, feeding cattle from hay stores. Still hard work, still dangerous, but different. More settled, more predictable, less free. The symbolic death was perhaps as important as the practical changes. The Old West, the romantic frontier of endless possibilities and individual freedom, died in the blizzards of 1886 to 87. It was replaced by practical ranching, by business principles, by sustainability concerns, by reality. The cowboy myth survived, of course, amplified by dime novels, later by movies and television, but the reality it was based on was gone. The few years of open range, of massive cattle, drives of cowboys as free-roaming workers on the frontier represented a brief moment in American history. 1865 to 1890, roughly. Just 25 years. And really at its peak for only about 10 of those years. The Great De-op marked the beginning of the end. What exactly did cowboys lose in that transition? More than just a job. They lost a lifestyle that, despite its hardships, offered something increasingly rare in industrializing America: genuine freedom of movement. A cowboy could quit one outfit and sign on with another, could drift from Texas to Montana following the work, could reinvent himself completely, leaving his past behind in a way that settled. Society didn't allow. The open range meant working under the sky rather than in factories or offices that were becoming the norm for American workers. It meant skills. And competence mattered more than family connections or education. A man who could ride, rope, and handle cattle had value regardless of where he came from or what his background was. That meritocracy was imperfect, certainly influenced by racial and ethnic prejudice, but it was more open than most segments of American society at the time. Cowboys also lost the camaraderie of the trail. Modern ranch work was more isolated, more routine. You worked the same land with the same handful of people doing similar tasks day after day. The trail drive, for all its misery, had variety. New country every day, new challenges. The shared adventure of crossing rivers, navigating storms, dealing with stampedes. The bonds formed during those months on the trail were strong, forged by shared hardship and mutual dependence. The pay got better in the new system, ironically. Year-round employment with regular wages beat seasonal trail work economically. But money wasn't everything. The old-time cowboys who struggled to adapt weren't just being stubborn or nostalgic. They'd tasted a kind of freedom that was disappearing from America, and they mourned its loss even as they understood intellectually why it had to end. But the winter of 1886-87 wasn't the only story of survival and death on the frozen frontier. Countless individual cowboys faced their own battles with winter, their own struggles to stay alive when nature tried to kill them. Some succeeded, some failed. All of their stories deserve remembering. Consider James Clyman and William Sublette. In the winter of 1824, not cowboys technically, they were mountain men, trappers working the Rocky Mountains. But they faced the same challenges, the same enemy, cold that wanted them dead. They were trapping in the Wind River Valley in Wyoming, staying with a Crow village for the winter. When late in the season they went out hunting for meat. Food was running low, and someone had to go find game. They were caught by a blizzard, one of those sudden storms that gives no warning. Miles from camp with nothing but their buffalo robes, rifles, and possibles bags. Temperature dropped like a stone. Snow came in thick and fast. They were in trouble, and they knew it. They managed to kill a buffalo, which should have saved them. Fresh meat for food, the hide for shelter. But starting a fire became nearly impossible. Their hands were too numb from cold to hold the flint and steel properly. Sparks wouldn't catch. The wind kept blowing out any flame they managed to start. They tried using their flintlock rifles to start fire, but that didn't work either. Sublette was dying. That's not dramatic exaggeration. He was shutting down, hypothermia taking him, slipping toward unconsciousness and death. Cloman kept trying, desperately, knowing if he didn't get fire started soon, both of them would die. Finally, searching through the ashes of an old fire they'd made earlier, Clyman found a single coal, barely warm, almost dead. He nursed it, blew on it gently, transferred it to tinder, coaxed it into flame. That tiny coal, that bit of luck, saved both their lives. They survived, obviously, or we wouldn't know the story. But barely. Sublette went on to become one of the most successful mountain men of the era, eventually a partner in the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. Clyman became a famous guide and later led wagon trains across the Oregon Trail. But both carried the memory of that night, how close they'd come, how thin the line was between life and death in winter. Or consider John Portuguese Phillips in his legendary ride in December 1866. Fort Phil Kearny in Wyoming Territory was under siege. Captain Fetterman and 80 men had been killed by Lakota warriors in what became known as the Fetterman Massacre. The fort was desperate for help, but the nearest reinforcements were at Fort Laramie, 236 miles away through winter mountains. Phillips, actually from the Azores but nicknamed Portuguese, volunteered to make the ride. Everyone knew it was likely a death sentence. 236 miles, dead of winter, through territory where Lakota warriors were actively hunting for targets. Temperature at 30 below or colder. But without help, the fort would fall and everyone in it would die. Phillips left. December 21st, 1866. He rode for 4 days straight, day and night, through blizzards, through temperatures that hovered around 40 below, avoiding Native American patrols, pushing his horse to the absolute limit. His feet and hands suffered severe frostbite. He hallucinated from exhaustion and cold, but he kept riding. He arrived at Fort Laramie on Christmas Day, during a Christmas ball the officers were holding. He burst into the party, half frozen, barely conscious, and delivered his message. The fort sent reinforcements. Fort Phil Kearny was saved, but Phillips' horse died shortly after arrival, ridden literally to death, and Phillips himself never fully recovered. He lost most of his toes too. Frostbite. He died in 1883, likely from complications relating to that ride. It became one of the most famous rides in frontier history, an example of courage and endurance that bordered on superhuman, but it also shows the cost. Phillips sacrificed his health, possibly his lifespan, and certainly his horse's life to save others. That was the calculus of frontier survival. Someone had to pay the price. The children's blizzard of January 12, 1888, produced one of the most remarkable survival stories. Schoolteacher Minnie Freeman saving her students. Freeman was teaching in a one-room schoolhouse near Seymour, Nebraska. 16 students, ages 6 to 15, under her care. It was a beautiful morning, unusually warm for January, around 30 degrees. Then the blizzard hit, not gradually. Suddenly, temperature dropped 50 degrees in minutes. Wind screamed to 45 miles per hour. Snow flew so thick you couldn't see anything. And the schoolhouse, a flimsy wooden structure, started to collapse under the wind's force. Freeman faced an impossible choice: stay in the building and likely be crushed when it came apart, or lead children out into a blizzard where visibility was 0 and temperature was 40 below with wind chill. Both options could kill them all. She chose to move. She tied the children together with twine so they wouldn't get separated. She picked up the smallest children. She led them out into the whiteout. Trying to reach a farmhouse she remembered being half a mile away. They got lost immediately. In that visibility, directions were meaningless. She wandered blind, carrying children, pulling others, trying to keep them all together, trying to keep them moving. Some children were crying. She sang to keep their spirits up, her voice almost lost in the wind. She nearly gave up multiple times, nearly just sat down with them to wait for death. But she stumbled onto a fence line, followed it, found the farmhouse. All 16 children survived. Minnie Freeman became a national hero, her story printed in newspapers across the country, songs written about her bravery. Meanwhile, across the Great Plains that same day, 235 people died in the blizzard. Most were children walking home from school. Not every story has a heroic ending. In spring of 1885, a cowboy's body was found in Montana Territory, frozen sitting against a tree. He was never identified. No one ever came looking for him. He had a letter in his pocket, addressed to his mother, describing being lost in a blizzard, knowing he was dying. Writing by moonlight during a brief, clear moment in the storm, the letter ended mid-sentence, "Tell Ma I tried." His fingers had frozen before he could finish. The person who found him kept the letter, and it was mentioned in a newspaper article, becoming one of those haunting pieces of frontier history. How many other cowboys died alone like this, bodies never found, names forgotten? How many mothers waited for sons who never came home, never knowing what happened? Another survival story involves three cowboys trapped in a line shack during the winter of 1886 to 87, that same terrible winter that killed so many cattle. They were at a remote cabin in the Montana Badlands, expecting to be there for 2 weeks before being relieved. The blizzards hit and they were cut off. 2 weeks became 3 months. Their supplies ran out after the first month. Then they faced starvation. They killed one of their 3 horses, the hardest decision they'd ever made, but necessary. They rationed the horse meat carefully, making it last as long as possible. They boiled the bones for broth when the meat was gone. When they ran out of firewood, they started burning furniture. Table, chairs, anything that would burn. The psychological toll was brutal. 3 men, trapped in a tiny cabin, slowly starving. No idea if or when they'd be rescued, watching their supplies dwindle day by day. They argued violently over meaningless things. One stopped talking altogether, just sat staring at the wall. They carved marks on the wall to count days, then stopped. When the count became too depressing, they were found in April when the snow finally melted enough for a relief crew to reach them. All 3 were alive, which was a miracle, but one was partially blind from snow blindness from a brief attempt to walk out. Another had lost fingers and toes to frostbite. The third couldn't speak for weeks, some combination of trauma and physical damage. All 3 quit cowboying afterward. They'd survived, but the experience had broken something in them. They'd seen too close how easily you could die out here, how thin the margin was, how much depended on luck. These stories share common threads. Split-second decisions that determined whether you lived or died. Random chance playing a huge role. The line between survival and death being so thin you could barely see it, and survivors often carrying permanent damage, physical or psychological, from their experiences. Why did some people survive when others in the same situation died? Historians and researchers have debated this question. Luck certainly played a role. Being in the right place at the right time, finding that coal ember, stumbling onto that fence line, having just enough supplies to last just long enough. But there was more to it than luck. The people who survived tended to share certain traits and behaviors. They kept moving when everything in their bodies screamed to stop. They made hard decisions quickly, without second guessing. They stayed calm when panic would have been understandable. They used every resource available, wasting nothing. And critically, they didn't give up. Even when death seemed certain, even when continuing seemed pointless, they kept trying. The mental aspect of survival was perhaps more important than the physical. Your mind could kill you faster than cold could. The moment you accepted death, the moment you gave up, you were done. Bodies were found that had no physical reason to be dead. They weren't frozen enough. They had supplies available, but they'd died anyway, having mentally surrendered. This phenomenon was noted at the time and studied later. Cowboys learned to recognize the signs in each other. A man going quiet, sitting down to rest and not getting back up, saying he was fine when obviously he wasn't, giving away his possessions. These were warning signs that someone was giving up, and other cowboys would try to snap him out of it, keep him engaged, force him to keep moving. The psychological coping mechanisms that worked varied by person. Some used anger, rage at the cold, fury at their situation, determination to not let nature win. Anger provided energy, motivation to keep fighting. Others focused on details, breaking survival down into small, achievable goals. Not thinking about reaching camp 5 miles away, just getting to that tree 50 yards ahead, then the next landmark, then the next dot. Talking to themselves helped some cowboys maintain mental coherence. Giving themselves orders aloud: get up, move your feet, check your fingers, keep riding. The sound of their own voice kept them grounded in reality, prevented them from drifting into hypothermic confusion. Memories of home and family were They could provide motivation, reason to survive, something to fight for. But they could also make the present suffering worse. By contrast, could lead to despair about ever getting back. The cowboys who survived tended to keep these thoughts brief and focused, using them as motivation rather than dwelling on what they'd lost. Companionship transformed survival. Having another person with you meant mutual encouragement, practical help, and, crucially, someone to stay alive for. The logic of if I die, he dies kept people going when they might otherwise have given up. They'd keep moving for the other person, even when they couldn't find motivation for themselves. Experience mattered, but not always the way you'd expect. Veterans who'd survived previous winters knew what worked and what didn't, made better decisions, didn't panic. But overconfidence could kill. Old-timers who thought they'd seen worse sometimes took unnecessary risks, didn't respect the danger. Enough. The sweet spot was being experienced enough to be competent, but humble enough to respect nature. The cowboys who survived to tell these stories were ultimately lucky. Lucky to have the right skills at the right time. Lucky to make the right decisions. Lucky to avoid the countless random accidents that could kill you. And they knew it. Most survivors were reluctant to take credit, attributing their survival to luck or providence rather than their own actions. But their stories became part of cowboy culture, told and retold around campfires, passed from experience to air. Hands to greenhorns, lessons coded in narrative. Old Joe died because he did X, so don't do X. Pete survived because he did Y, so remember Y. Building a collective wisdom that might save the next generation. And yet, despite all this accumulated knowledge, despite all the survival techniques and preparation and experience, the winter of 1886 to 87 proved that sometimes nature was simply too powerful. Sometimes the smart decision was to recognize that the old ways weren't working. Sometimes survival meant adaptation, change, accepting that the world you knew was ending. The great deot didn't just kill cattle, it killed a way of life. The open range system was dead, and everyone knew it. The question became, what would replace it? And what would happen to the cowboys who'd lived by the old system? The changes came quickly. Ranchers who survived or who rebuilt made different choices. They kept fewer cattle, recognizing that overstocking had contributed to the Perot disaster. They fenced their ranges, controlling where cattle grazed, managing the land more carefully. Barbed wire, which cowboys had initially hated and resisted, became standard. The devil's rope that symbolized the end of the open range. Hay production and storage became priorities. Build barns and sheds to store hay. Grow it on irrigated bottomland. Buy it from farmers if necessary. Have enough stored to feed your cattle through bad winters. This required investment, infrastructure, planning. It was less romantic, but more sustainable. Better breeding programs developed hardier cattle. The scrawny Longhorns, tough but inefficient, were bred with Herefords and other British breeds. The resulting animals were meatier, brought better prices, and handled winter conditions better. The iconic Longhorn gradually disappeared, replaced by cattle more suited to a managed ranching system. The long trail drives ended as railroads expanded. Towns that had existed to serve trail drives faded away or had to find new purposes. Dodge City, Abilene. These famous cattle towns became relics of a past era within a decade of the DR. For cowboys, the transformation was profound. They went from trail drivers to ranch hands, from seasonal workers moving between jobs to year-round employees at fixed locations, from men who lived by mobility and freedom to men who stayed in one place and drew regular wages. Some couldn't make the transition. The older cowboys, the ones who'd known the true open range, often left the profession entirely. They couldn't adapt to fences and routine. Some became outlaws, using their skills with horses and guns in less legal pursuits. Some drifted into towns, taking whatever work they could find. Some just disappeared into history, forgotten. The younger generation adapted more easily. Men who'd only known the tail end of the open range era, who didn't have nostalgia for how things used to be, became the new ranchers and ranch hands. They learned the new methods, accepted the new reality, built the modern ranching industry. The work was still hard, still dangerous, still required long hours in brutal conditions. Winters still meant cold and hardship, but it was more predictable, more controllable. You weren't riding through blizzards with 3,000 cattle anymore. You were feeding hay from your stored supply, checking your fenced pastures, bringing animals into shelter during the worst weather. Cultural preservation happened in odd ways. Rodeos emerged as a way to keep cowboy skills alive, turning work techniques into competitive sports. Rope tricks, bronc riding, bull riding, steer wrestling. These were things cowboys did on the job, now performed for audiences. It kept traditions alive, even as the actual work changed. Western wear became fashion. The hat, the boots, the jeans. Originally, practical work clothes became symbols of American identity. People who'd never seen a cow wore cowboy hats. The clothing outlasted the lifestyle that created it. Country and Western music preserved the songs and stories. Those night watch songs cowboys sang staccato became the foundation for a musical genre that's still popular. The themes of loneliness, hardship, wide open spaces, these resonated beyond the actual cowboy experience. Art celebrated the era even as it ended. Charlie Russell, Frederick Remington, and others painted scenes of the open range, cattle drives, and cowboy life. Their work helped create and maintain the romantic myth while also documenting real aspects of history. Museums collected gear and artifacts, preserving material culture, but what was truly lost couldn't be preserved. The actual experience of that life, the danger, the freedom, the suffering, the complexity of it. Popular culture simplified cowboys into heroes or outlaws, ignoring most of what made them real. The hardship got romanticized. The violence got sensationalized. The mundane daily work got ignored. What remained in American culture was a simplified symbol. The cowboy as representing independence, rugged individualism, self-reliance, courage. These were values that resonated regardless of whether they accurately reflected historical cowboys. The symbol became more powerful than the reality. The real cowboys. The ones who rode through blizzards, who survived on beans and hardtack, who lost fingers to frostbite and friends to accidents, largely died anonymous and poor. Their names weren't remembered. Their sacrifices weren't commemorated. They were just working men who did a dangerous job for low pay in harsh conditions. But they left a legacy beyond the romantic myth. They proved human beings could endure almost unimaginable hardship. They developed practical techniques for surviving in extreme environments that are still studied. They showed both the capabilities and the limits of human adaptation. And their failures, like the Great Duke, taught lessons about sustainability and respecting nature's power. Modern parallels exist. We still face extreme weather. We still deal with the challenge of food production in harsh conditions. We still struggle with the balance between exploitation and sustainability. Climate change is making weather more extreme, more unpredictable, more dangerous. The lessons cowboys learned about preparing for the worst, respecting nature, not overstocking your range, are relevant again. The cowboy era lasted roughly 25 years, 1865 to 1890, with the peak being maybe 10 years in the middle. That's it, a blink in historical terms. But its impact on American culture and identity lasted far longer and shows no signs of fading. What would those cowboys think if they could see how they're remembered? Probably they'd be confused by the mythology. They weren't heroes. They were workers, doing a job, sometimes succeeding, sometimes failing, always trying. That's all. The winter of 1886 to 87 was the climax of their story. The moment when the dream hit reality hard enough to shatter, when nature proved stronger than economics, stronger than determination, stronger than human will. The cowboys who survived carried the memory of that winter for the rest of their lives, carried the knowledge of how fragile their world had been. Think about this. A cowboy on night watch in January 1887, before the big storm hit, riding around a herd of sleeping cattle on a Montana plain, singing softly to keep them calm. Stars brilliant overhead, cold seeping through every layer of clothing, breath fogging in front of his face. Alone with his thoughts and his duty. He's 24 years old. Though he looks older, his hands are scarred from rope burns. His face is weathered from constant sun and wind. He's missing 2 teeth from a horse kick. His fingers ache in the cold from old breaks that never healed right. He makes $30 a month and considers himself lucky to have the job. He doesn't know that in 2 weeks, the world he knows will end. That the blizzard will come and kill most of these cattle he's watching. That the open range he's riding across will be fenced within a few years. That the job he's doing will essentially cease to exist in its current form. That he's living in the last days of an era. He just knows he's cold and tired. He knows dawn will come eventually. He knows he has a job to do until then. So he keeps riding, keeps singing, keeps watching, doing his duty, being a cowboy. That's the reality, not glamorous, not romantic, just cold and tired and doing the job. But there's a kind of nobility in that, isn't there? In doing hard, necessary work in brutal conditions, not for glory, but because it needs doing. in facing nature at its worst and refusing to quit, in surviving not through heroics but through stubbornness and small competencies and sheer determination not to die. The cowboys who froze in the blizzards of 1886 to 87 died doing that work. The ones who survived carried scars from it, and all of them, survivors and victims alike, deserve to be remembered as they actually were. Not as myths, but as men who faced winter on the frontier and sometimes won and sometimes lost, but always tried. The frozen prairie in spring, after the thaw, presented an ugly truth. Dead cattle everywhere. The grass underneath struggling to grow through the corruption, but it did grow. Nature healed itself. Within a few years, you could barely tell there had been a catastrophe. The land recovered. The cattle were replaced. The industry rebuilt differently. The cowboys moved on too. Those who survived found other work or adapted to the new ranching system. They told their stories to whoever would listen, though fewer and fewer people wanted to hear as time passed. By the 1920s and 30s, when historians finally thought to interview the last surviving cowboys of the open range era, most were elderly, their memories fading, their stories dismissed as exaggerations by people who hadn't been there. But we have enough accounts, enough letters, enough recorded stories to piece together what it was really like, to understand the reality beyond the myth, to appreciate what those men endured and what they accomplished and what they failed at. If you've stayed with this journey from beginning to end, you've experienced in your warm, comfortable space, through words, what cowboys experienced in brutal reality. You've ridden through the cold, felt the wind, watched the cattle die. You've learned how men survived and how they didn't. You've seen an era die in the snow. Before you drift off to sleep tonight, appreciate the warmth around you. Cowboys would have envied your comfort more than you can imagine. The walls that block wind, the heat that keeps you warm, the security of knowing you'll wake up tomorrow not frozen. They rode into death, those cowboys, into blizzards and cold and conditions that wanted to kill them. Some rode back out, some didn't. All were changed by the experience. Their story is triumph and tragedy intertwined, glory and horror mixed together, human will tested against natural law. Natural law won. It always does, eventually. But human will was magnificent in the attempt. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into frontier history, into the real lives of cowboys beyond the Hollywood myth, consider subscribing to this channel. More history is coming, more forgotten stories, more truths about how people actually lived and worked and survived. History should be learned, and sleeping to it is just fine. These stories deserve to be told, and you deserve to hear them now. Sleep well. You're warm and safe tonight. Dream of open ranges if you want, but be grateful for your walls and your heat and your security. The cowboys earned their rest. You've earned yours too. Good night.